John Lowell wanted this mill built in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and he wanted it built to his specifications, and he also wanted it built quickly. Therein lies the rub, the quickly part.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. I'm Steve Guerrero, the Director of Education here, and it's my honor to introduce this evening's Mill Talk. We are joined tonight by UMass Lowell Professor Robert Forrant, a distinguished historian and author on the topic of industrial labor. His most recent book, Where Are the Workers? Interpreting Labor and Working Class History at Museums and Historic Sites, was published in 2022. His 2024 article on the 1860 Pemberton Mill collapse in the New England Quarterly forms the basis for his portion of tonight's talk. After Professor Forrant, we will hear from Gabriel Porter, a safety and health specialist and process safety management coordinator for the Boston Regional Office of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. In January of 1860, the Pemberton Mill in Lawrence suffered a catastrophic collapse. It was an industrial tragedy that claimed 98 lives, revealed systemic failures, and left questions of accountability unresolved. Tonight, we'll connect history to modern-day practices, offering insights into the ongoing fight for a safer workplace and perspective on how far we've come from Pemberton to the present. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming first Professor Bob Forrant. Bob?
Thank you, and thanks everybody for being here. There'll be a math quiz at some point because you have to pay strict attention. The Pemberton fell in 1860, and you will find out in the presentation about OSHA when OSHA was established. And then the question is going to be, how long did it take? A long time for sure, but we need like the number. And so that'll be my challenge to all of you to figure out. So, not surprisingly, work in the early 19th century in this complex or any other one would have been extraordinarily dangerous. There were not any regulations to speak of with respect to guards on machinery, elevator safety, air quality. Nobody quite thought about those things in the period that we're talking about. This is one of many little stories I could have found for this evening. When you read through this, you see how many, just in that little paragraph, how many different people lost how many different limbs, fingers, appendages, digits, whatever you want to call them, in a really short period of time. I've read through lots of Lowell newspapers from the period from 1830 to 1860, and almost every day I could have found something that would have had an accident of one sort or another. This is what the Pemberton looked like when it opened. It was built in the early 1850s, and the story of its building is actually the story of its collapse. And I'm going to talk to you about why it fell and what happened in the aftermath. So this is what it looked like, and then that's what it looked like. It literally fell over. It started on one end, like if we were in this complex and it was going to go. It just basically, like if you play, as a kid, you lined up dominoes and flicked them down. It sort of fell back to front that way on a site in Lawrence, on one of the canals in Lawrence. There's now a mill building in the exact place where the Pemberton was. But it fell over with no notice, obviously. People were trapped inside. It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon in January, so it was dark, cold, not a lot of equipment to remove the rubble to save people. Several people lost their lives in the immediate collapse, but then other people lost their lives actually much later in the evening in the fires that started in the rubble. There were a series of really horrible accidents where people were trying to rescue people using lanterns, kerosene lanterns, which is what you had at the time. They were putting them into these holes into the basement of the building, and as they were on ropes, and as they were swinging, every once in a while one would hit some of the rubble and break open and basically spill out and light the cloth and whatever else was in the rubble on fire. And more people actually lost their lives in the fires than in the initial collapse. The problem of the Pemberton began at its inception. And by that I mean that the people that wanted the mill built, John Lowell, one of the famous families of Massachusetts, the Cabots, the Lowells, and what have you, John Lowell wanted this mill built in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and he wanted it built to his specifications, and he also wanted it built quickly. Therein lies the rub, the quickly part. He wanted it built quickly, and to make that happen, he negotiated with Charles Storrow, whose photo is there. Not the Storrow Drive. His son, Charles Storrow's son, actually is the Storrow that Storrow Drive is named after. But Charles Storrow was the person in charge of the Essex Corporation in Lawrence that had the responsibility for building the mills. And the economy was in a bit of a slump in New England at this point. There wasn't a lot of construction going on. John Lowell came to Storrow and said, hey, I've got a deal for you. I want to build this big mill complex, but I want complete authority to use any supplier that I want to use and to essentially hire any work crews that I want to use because I want this building to go up really, really quickly. And Storrow agrees. And in doing the research, I actually found the document in the archives at the Lawrence History Center. And you can see the agreement that they signed that basically gives Storrow pretty much carte blanche to build this mill. And we'll see in a second what ultimately is going to happen as a consequence of that. When the mill falls, by state law, by Commonwealth law, there's supposed to be an inquest because there were deaths. What happened? And so before the fires in the rubble are even put out, they have the inquest. So it's pretty remarkable. Obviously, it wouldn't happen that way today. It probably would take 5 years before there was an inquest because everybody would be fighting about something before it ever happened. But the inquest happened right away in Lawrence City Hall chambers. Several leading citizens of Lawrence were on the inquest. It was kind of like a jury trial, but not really. They basically heard evidence as to what happened, and then they were basically tasked with figuring out who to blame. They were supposed to come up with who was responsible, and if anything, what should happen to them in the aftermath. Right away at the beginning of the inquest, people testified that when the mill opened in 1853, before they had even put machinery in it, it was actually separating. It was basically sort of coming apart literally at the seams, at the corners. People remarked about how you could see daylight out the corners of the building. Obviously that's problematic. There aren't even any machines in there yet, and it's already nobody quite knows why. But what they do is they basically get, as the slide indicates, tonnage of steel bands, and they basically put like the equivalent of elastic around the building to squeeze it back together again. And this is common knowledge in Lawrence at the time. And so so the inquest, it's interesting. There's actually no, like today would be like there would have been a stenographer's record, or now there would be a recording or whatever you would have, right? AI would do a digital something or other of it. No such thing exists for this inquest. And so basically in researching this, I had to read all the newspapers because the newspapers were there every day taking down word for word what people were saying about the building. And so basically I pieced together the story from reading a half a dozen newspapers. One of the ones that was really fascinating was this Architects and Mechanics Journal. Steel, like the industry of making iron and steel and engineering, scientific engineering, things like that were in their infancy. And this was like a trade publication of people who think about science and engineering and construction and building buildings. And they sent a reporter. And they actually had the most unbiased, I guess you could say. They were just like the facts, right? And the fact that the building was coming apart tremendously bothered them. The Eastern Argus was another newspaper I read. They have this incredible quote. I'm not going to read it, but they say this is like this incredible catastrophe. What happened? How could this have happened? Newspapers actually from all over the world start showing up in Lawrence to cover the story. British newspapers, French newspapers, Italian newspapers, German newspapers, anybody that had sent immigrants in the 1840s, 1850s, basically sent reporters to come across and cover what happened. And so eventually the story is getting out into the large world. And nothing like this has ever happened before. We're in the blush of this first industrial revolution that starts building a complex that ends up looking like this one. And the idea that these buildings could cave in, nobody had ever thought about that as a possibility. So now they start interviewing people who had worked for years building buildings in Lawrence, had 25 years, 30 years of experience building mills in Lowell, building mills in Lawrence, and they interviewed and they gave their testimony. And to a person, they all basically said the pillars that held up the building were inferior. So I'm not saying that one is inferior back there. This building is still standing. But if you can see around here where there are pillars that are holding up the building, obviously they have a tremendous amount of weight on them. And they basically, everybody that testifies says there was something wrong with these pillars. And so I kept reading over and over again, the pillars, it's the pillars, it's the pillars. Then I found a picture of one. And so here's a little quiz. If this was my class at UMass Lowell, I would basically say now, tell me what you see. So, all of you budding engineers, tell me what you see. What's wrong with this picture? What?
It's not concentric.
It's not uniform. It's not concentric. It's not anything it's not anything that thing should look like. The wall on one side of it is too thin, right? And people are testifying to that in effect. Charles Bigelow, who's the chief engineer of the Essex Company, the person responsible for oversight of all the buildings, all the mills being built, was told that the Eagle Foundry in Boston had the pillars ready, and he should send somebody to Boston to inspect them. And he didn't. The pillars arrive in Lawrence, one of them basically being rolled off a wagon about this high off the ground onto dirt, rolls off the wagon and shatters. Now, right away, I'm thinking, if that's me, and that's supposed to hold up the building, wait a minute, we have a problem. But the difficulty is, John Lowell wants this building built. And he's urging Putnam and Bigelow and everybody else, get the building built, get the building built. Again, right away in the inquest. When the mill fell, I knew right away. Everybody after the fact, right? Which often happens in an accident, right? Well, I knew that was going to happen. Well, why didn't you do something ahead of time? So the day that the mill falls, so the pillars are no good. That's a given at this point. Everybody's testified the pillars are no good. On the day that the mill falls, as one of the people testifies, they're trying to move. I'm trying to see sort of the equivalent here of a big piece of machinery like this one over in the corner. They're trying to move a really large piece of machinery. They don't have trucks and dollies and the kind of stuff you would have today to get under a machine and put it on wheels and move it. They basically put gigantic rubber bands around it, and they use the pillar as a fulcrum to pull the machine around, to move the machine where they wanted to go on the floor of the 5th floor in the back end of the building. And one of the people that testifies later, oh yeah, I thought I heard a pop, but I wasn't sure. And the thing about the pillars is, like, that's a good, like the one behind you is a good example. Like, they go through the floor and connect up to the next floor. And so there's like a little mechanism in between the floors, a smaller pin, that goes from the top of that pillar through the floorboards into the bottom of the next pillar up. And then basically that sets up the system of holding the mill building up. One of the pins breaks. Then the Architects and Mechanics Journal weighs in again. This is what, when I found this, I said, okay, now I get it. So the Architects and Mechanics Journal, again, they have no skin in the game, so to speak, in terms of the foundry or whatever. And they say, oh yeah, they look at the pillars and they say, yeah, we figured this out. We know exactly what they did. And they basically said, they essentially, and they used this term, they basically engaged in skimming, which means that when you make pillars, when you make these castings, if the company that you're making them for, and this came out in the inquest, if the company you're making them for charges you for the pillars by the weight, you make them perfect. But if the company that you're building them for is basically paying for each of the pieces, if you skim on the material, right? You know what skimming means, right? You skim, whatever. And so that's why those pillars are the way they are. It was purposefully done. And it turns out later that the Essex foundry that was used, the Eagle foundry, that was used, had a history of doing this. But because the deal got made between Lowell and Storrow, they used an inferior foundry when, ironically, the Essex Corporation had its own foundry almost across the street from where the Pemberton Mill was, that ordinarily they would have contracted that foundry to make the pillars. All the other mill buildings in Lawrence had pillars from that foundry in Lawrence, except for this one. And again, you can see this is another, if you actually want to go see a pillar, there's one in the Lawrence Heritage State Park. What's been fascinating, I tried to get them to let me take it tonight, and they said, no, it's too cold. If you drop it, it will break. They have let me take it out of the museum from time to time when I've talked about it, and it's really something when you see it. I mean, the picture is pretty clear. But so the question, so two questions I thought about, and again, sort of in terms of thinking about OSHA, occupational safety and health, and where we've sort of gone in between. The question at the time in the inquest was, does anybody have any liability? 90 some odd people lost their lives. Many of them were 14 and under, young immigrant women, mostly Irish. Some people never identified and are in an unmarked grave in Lawrence, Massachusetts. So was anybody liable? The Massachusetts Supreme Court in this 1842 case had basically ruled in a railroad case, anybody that goes to work knows it's risky. Tough luck. And that was the, I mean, I'm obviously not a legal scholar, so I'm not giving you the exact legal wording for this, but in essence, that's what they said. Tough luck. In the immediate aftermath, legislation gets filed in the Commonwealth, in the state legislature, to try to create an inspection system for mills when they're built, and then periodic inspection thereafter to essentially maintain and make sure mill buildings are safe. It passes the House very, very easily and dies in the Senate and just disappears. When I was doing research, the librarians at the Massachusetts Archives basically made me copies. That's the original handwritten bills as they were filed in the legislature. And so I found this really interesting that everything was sort of killed. John Lowell, basically wrote a letter right away after the building fell, essentially saying, not me, I didn't have anything to do with it, which got big play in all the Boston newspapers. After the mill was built, 3 or 4 years afterwards, they sold it. So Lowell also said, not my building, not my fault. But again, his thumbprints were all over the construction of the building. In the end, the only person that suffered any consequence was Charles Bigelow, the person who probably should have sent somebody to Boston to inspect the pillars, and should have, when the pillars came to Lawrence and one broke, said, we can't use these, and didn't. And he was basically charged with responsibility for 22 deaths. Those were the deaths of everybody that they think was killed instantly when the mill building fell. All the other deaths basically are attributed to the fire, and they basically absolve Bigelow of that. Nothing happens. He doesn't go to jail, but he suffers the consequence of having this obviously around his neck. Bigelow is an interesting character, and just quickly in a minute, he's a West Point graduate. He's a trained engineer. He has built several forts and waterworks and other things for the military around the country before he's hired to Lawrence. He's highly valued for what he knows, but in the end, he's saddled with the responsibility for this. And the Architects and Mechanics Journal weighs in again, and they basically call out the inquest people and say, you failed, by basically absolving the owners of the building of any responsibility, any liability for what happened. You're basically setting up, they say, this is their words, this is prove at least a dangerous precedent for recklessness. And they're really upset. What's interesting is, subsequent to this happening, in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, there were industrial engineering conferences all over the country, and the Pemberton is like a major discussion point, why it fell, and could anything have been done to prevent it having fallen? What are there any lessons we can learn in building even bigger and bigger industrial complexes? And so I got a good dose of the science and the engineering. Fortunately, I teach at an engineering school, so I got to ask all the engineering faculty, like, what does this mean? I have no idea what they're saying here. But it became the grist for lots of papers, lots of academic research, and then it's basically since then more or less disappeared. And I just find it, I got intrigued by it, which is why I ended up writing what I did. So thank you for listening. Fortunately, we do better now than we did then.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much, Bob. I'm just going to reintroduce our second speaker tonight. So Gabriel Porter is the Safety and Health Specialist and Process Safety Management Coordinator for the Boston Regional Office of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Gabriel's going to tell us a little bit about OSHA, and then we're going to engage in our discussion. Gabriel.
All right, so Bob talked a lot about Pemberton and the collapse and the response. And I'll say one thing, there's sort of a discussion about persistence over 50 years, and so let's go back to 1860 and move a little forward. I think generally the story of safety and worker protection is one of just trying and failing, trying again and failing, and watching things happen and being frustrated. So the actual first worker protections, not related to Pemberton necessarily, but certainly that was part of it, actually comes back to Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Factory Act of 1877, so do your math, 1860, 1877. That was the very first safety agency, any sort of regulatory agency, and it took all those years basically of people being frustrated and seeing what was happening to have something done. Right around that same time, we talk about worker protections and legislation and what the government does. Well, insurance companies don't like to pay for collapses and stuff like that either. Another point in Massachusetts history, right around the same time, insurance companies were tired of buildings burning down, and they wanted everybody to install sprinklers uniformly. So they formed the National Fire Protection Association, which is still based in Boston. That was right around the same time, I forget the exact year, but late 1870s, early 1880s. And their initial standards were just to make sure that every place that they insured had sprinklers, because they're sick of fires. So money talks almost more than workers, but it is what it is. Ironically, they found it worked really well. They realized that electricity was becoming a big thing in mills, and they wanted to try to protect electrical hazards. Electricity starts fires, so along comes electrical standards, and NFPA decides to absorb that, and now the National Electric Code is written and maintained by NFPA. Fast forward to Triangle Factory Fire, which hopefully people are familiar with. That's a big moment in history for worker protection, but also for insurance. That was what led to the establishment of the National Life Safety Code. So going back to the Massachusetts Factory Act, it's actually modeled on British Factory Acts, which are basically worker health and safety protections going back to 1800 or so, where the British did their worker protection. The initial Factory Act talked about things like floor loading, building construction, and had their own enforcement team, basically a police force, so to speak. Much of that enforcement has rolled into the various state agencies, your boiler code people, your building code people, electrical code, they all kind of dispersed to various state agencies. So Massachusetts being the first, New England kind of leading, but then spreading through the country. There's a loose affiliation of all these state agencies that were doing a little bit of regulation, mostly crunching numbers. It kind of became safety became kind of a statistics thing for quite a while. And I guess part of the New Deal, I'm not the greatest with the history on this part where the Bureau of Labor Standards started, but initially worker protection was started right around the time of FDR and was mostly just statistics to support the state agencies to do their regulation and working along with other standard associations like NFPA. Eventually people decide something needs to be done. There was a Kennedy promise to the workers that they would work to develop an agency. Unfortunately, he was assassinated in that process, so things kind of went dead. The Johnson administration picked up on it. That bill died in Congress, but not fully, survived long enough to be signed as the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. So you saw December of 1970. So basically 1971 is when we opened our doors, and the rest is the history you saw in the video. So one of the things I was thinking when I was talking to Steve is how would OSHA handle the Pemberton Mill? That's the topic of discussion. So what would we do today? And as Bob was speaking, I was just kind of chuckling is probably not the best way to say it, but certainly that's what I was thinking is you don't necessarily see things a lot different these days. We have all these worker protections. We certainly don't see them with the same amount of frequency, but and we can say with some confidence and inflate our chests that things are a lot less around here, but those building collapses still happen. Not with the same frequency and not for the same reasons. But they certainly still happen. So we would be there probably the first day, not part of the inquest, but just hanging out with the rescue crews, trying to figure out, talk to people what went on. And we'd be part of, we'd basically just sit there and watch the emergency response folks do their thing, because we're not emergency responders. And then we'd gather some information and sort of decide how we would assess blame. I'm looking back and thinking, well, how would we assess blame as somebody who's done that plenty in my job? And I could say with a fair amount of certainty, we'd use our floor loading standard, which was one of the first standards that came in. You know, we wouldn't expect to see nearly as many looms or any of those materials, those kind of weights, that number of people even, for that matter. So we do have a standard on that, so that would be addressed. As far as the building construction, it would be a little more confusing how we would assign blame, mainly because the owners at the time of the collapse were not the folks that built it. So just thinking about that, and we may or may not have figured out something. We do have what's known as a general duty clause. So we have a list of things you can't do, but then we also have this little piece that says any other recognized safety or health hazard. So we would have to show that it was a recognized hazard, and we would have to show that the folks that owned the company at the time had the responsibility. We probably could have, if when they bought the building, they did their due diligence and understood that they shouldn't overload the floors and stuff like that, and we would issue what's called a willful violation, most likely. Just, we knew it was bad, and we just knew or should have known that it was bad. And because of that, we would just jack up the fines. I think most of the blame assessment would probably come from local code enforcement, so state code enforcement, local code enforcement, and you know, OSHA would be part of that, so we'd work together. So that's basically how we would handle Pemberton, and I was thinking now would be a good time to just bring everybody up and I'll sit and answer some questions, because otherwise I'm just going to keep talking all night. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Gabe, have a seat. Welcome Bob back to the stage. I'll repeat questions so that we can hear it, but my goal is that we kind of engage in a discussion connecting the past and the present. So one of the things, Bob, I will start with you. You know, this role of tragedy, that something bad has to happen before we start wondering why did that happen and what should we do to prevent it. Aside from Pemberton, can you trace a line in terms of tragedy, like you mentioned the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York? Are there other examples of kind of tragedies that finally push this 19th century anything goes attitude towards a more systemic protective network?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that happened a lot in Massachusetts that I know about, and I'm sure it happened in other states as well, is when factories started moving in the direction of using steam boilers, for example. Those were always blowing up and flying through the roof of the building and ending up like yards down the road and causing mayhem and death and destruction. And so I liken it in a way to sort of like today with certain new technologies and chemicals and things like that, that it does sadly take like something like that, like that people don't necessarily build in the safeguards initially, because doing that costs money. And so it takes an insurance company to say, well, like, you have to do this because we're not going to pay out if you don't. And then you do it because then it becomes more cost effective to get to do it than to have a risk. And so that's a really serious example. I mean, the other one in textile mills and in machine shops and metalworking all over wherever there's industrialization going on, there's a lot of loss of fingers and parts of arms and things like that. There's actually quite a bit of carnage. And in the same way, that begins to lead to putting guards on machines and making, people are working with punch presses, for example, where you lose your concentration for a second. You should have pulled your hands out and you don't, and the press comes down. And so people start saying, well, what if we made harnesses so that when the press comes down, your arms are pulled out? Oh, yeah, we can do that, right? And so your question is actually right. It takes something like that, the same way with Triangle, it takes like a big tragedy. I mean, Triangle instituted bigger changes like in New York state law with respect to certain parts of health and safety and things like that. But I mean, the quiz that I asked you before, it was 111. 1860, 1971, the math question is 111. So if you think of like all of that time that elapses before there's a systematic, it does take catastrophe. And then even then it doesn't, in the Pemberton case, it's interesting that in 1877 when Mass starts the law and changing the law, one of the first people who's the top commissioner of that is from Lawrence. And had been one of the people that was involved with trying to figure out how to help workers who were hurt in the Pemberton. He ends up being the chairperson of this first safety committee in Massachusetts.
Interesting. And Gabe, one of the things we heard from Bob was that we knew this was going to happen, especially from the builders, from the workers, this pillar shattering and cast iron on the floor. What does OSHA have in place for people who either they're workers, builders, engineers, anyone involved in the process of kind of constructing a workplace, if they have concerns that code is not being met or something isn't happening, whistleblower protections, what does OSHA do with that kind of information when it's out there?
So it's a little bit complex, but not that complex. So you mentioned whistleblower protections. So that was one of the first things that was written into the OSHA Act 1970 that established OSHA. And it was actually hotly debated whether or not there would be protections for workers to reach out. And so in the Act it says anybody who raises concerns about safety or health is protected against discrimination for speaking up. Since then, ironically, pretty much all whistleblower protection, including Sarbanes-Oxley, has now come under OSHA. So that was one of the first protections for folks who did want to speak up and who felt it was necessary to speak up. And we still deal with that to this day. Every time somebody calls and says, well, I want to tell you about this, but please don't tell anybody who called. People are really concerned about their jobs, and so that's the first thing we tell everybody when we interview them. And anytime after an accident or anytime we're on an inspection, one of the questions we ask at the very end is, so what am I not seeing? Do you have anything else you want to bring up? Because it's not often you're sitting there with OSHA, so now's your chance to speak up. And so we do what we can to encourage people to speak up, and they do have those protections, and I think that was a big part of it is folks not answering those questions.
Absolutely. And what about, and this could be to either one of you, when we talk about local, state, and federal, I mean, we know that in the 19th century, this attitude towards a minimalist federal government, protection, and that a lot of it was left to the locals and to the federal, and a lot of times the locals had kind of political connections with these big industrialists that are building mills, and John Lowell himself was very well connected with the people who were making decisions in Beacon Hill. How do you pull apart kind of the responsibility of the feds, the state, and the locals? And does OSHA kind of navigate that space, or is it an either or? How does that work?
Well, it's not just an either or with state, local, and federal. There's a lot of federal agencies who have interest in different things. More recently, a good example of that, there was a fertilizer explosion in Texas. And OSHA had been out there, EPA had been out there, the fire department had been out there, the state of Texas had been out there, and everybody knew there was a massive pile of fertilizer, and that wasn't a good thing, ammonium nitrate. And there was a small fire, which kind of like with Pemberton, where there was a collapse and then people show up and then they accidentally burn the whole thing down. The firefighters showed up and caused a massive explosion, killed 15 firefighters, leveled a bunch of houses, and there was an executive order for the feds to work together. So now I'm part of a work group with EPA, Homeland Security, and OSHA, and we sort of chair that work group and then bring in all the other local folks, and we have those discussions, and that's meant to sort of, not just to assign responsibility to any one party, but also to make it easier for the employers, because we speak with one voice. A lot of times, the local folks come in, and it's not even necessarily connections, but just understanding of what they're looking at, the amount of training they have. So it's an opportunity for us all to work together to find those things unified, and also to make it easier for folks who are looking to us and want to do the right thing. And I feel like that's an important part to mention too, is there's a lot of folks out there that want to do the right thing and just don't know where to start. So.
And Bob, I don't know, I mean, we're talking 1860, so probably the federal government had bigger kind of issues on the verge of Civil War.
Yeah.
But, the inquest was happening in Lawrence City Hall, you said. Is it mostly localized in terms of the authorities to Lawrence? Does it register at all in terms of federal kind of policymakers or any?
No, there's, actually Abraham Lincoln says something about it when he's campaigning. And so there is some recognition. Again, a lot of newspapers cover it all over Europe, but the inquest itself, everybody on the inquest committee that's going to decide blame are all well-connected, pretty much owners of construction companies and builders and whatnot in Lawrence, who probably, I couldn't find anything where somebody said you better not find the wealthy people guilty here. But it stands to reason, if you're a local builder and you're building mill and you rely on contracts to build mills in Lawrence, and you're now sitting on this board, that you're going to hesitate to necessarily look. And the trail, again, because the out in this case, I think, is, as you mentioned, what you were saying before, the fact that the building changed hands. And so that's John Lowell right away. He says, not me, I don't own the building. What's really funny is when I was doing research, I went to Mass Historical Society, which has a lot of the papers of the Lowell family, and his sister-in-law keeps a diary. And the night that the building collapses, she writes in her diary, "You know this was your building." And in the article I wrote, I have this long quote from her diary where she says, this is, in so many words, she says, "Fool, this is your doing. Wow. You were the one rushing this to get it built, and you know it." And I thought, wow, this is really it's like a family drama here. And the legislation gets filed right away. I think his name is Tucker. He's a legislator from Cambridge who files the bill right away to do building inspections. And the argument is, right away, that will place an undue cost burden on people trying to build mills in Massachusetts, and they'll just leave. It will be bad for business if there are any regulations. And unless there are regulations everywhere, if there are regulations in Massachusetts, it will hurt Massachusetts businesses. And so it slides through the House really right away. I mean, it's read in committee, gone. In the Senate, it's never even read out of a committee. But the Senate is where the most concentrated wealth in Massachusetts sits. And so I think that just went there to die, and it just disappeared thereafter. But the tricky, I still think even now, the tricky thing in regulation is, as the US has gotten better at regulating dangerous workplaces, toxics, say black lung in coal mining, or asbestos, or asbestosis, or whatever it would be, a lot of the people doing that work just move it to some other place in the world where there are no regulations, and then you have like a building collapse in India or Pakistan or someplace, or just like there was just horrible mine disaster in South Africa, I think, last week, right, where a lot of people were trapped underground. Not the same regulations there would be in a mine like that in the United States, and so we still have these problems, and there's not a global, right? It was hard enough to get a federal one. To think that we're going to get a global one, not going to happen. And so there's a book that a former student of mine wrote called Exporting Harm. And basically she documents all these things where these things that we know are dangerous, people just go do someplace else.
Interesting. I have many more questions, but I want to see if anyone in the audience, if you ask your question, I'll repeat it so we can pick it up here. Yes, please. So did this add to something like building codes locally in terms of having a systematic way of enforcing codes around engineering and building safe buildings? Or when did they start?
So it would have started, from what I know, it would have started, you know better than I for sure on that, would have started in the 1870s, 1880s. There was an appreciation for the fact in Lawrence that we can't build something like this again. And there wasn't another collapse. So I think there was more care taken. And I think which I really didn't think about, but the point of the insurance companies was a really big deal. If you can make it more risky to do something bad, it might persuade people not to do it. And I think that the insurance companies played a big role. Actually, in most industrial cities, there are insurance maps, right, where the insurance companies went in and said and they basically coded different parts of the city with these industrial maps, said this is high risk, this is low risk. And that started having impacts on property and sprinklers and all the other things that you mentioned.
We have a map of this place in the next gallery over from the early 1900s.
That's a fire insurance map, sure.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
That's why we know where the buildings are, were back then.
Yep.
Let me just ask Gabe about building codes. Does OSHA play? Awesome. Does OSHA have any role in terms of building codes or enforcing building codes in any situation like that?
It's actually kind of reverse. So if you go back to, well, it's sort of a two-parter. So there's a lot of standards out there. We refer to them internally as consensus standards. So those are your American National Standards Institute, which kind of uniformly brought things in. So if you're looking for standards on conveyor belts or forklifts or aerial lifts, a lot of the local building codes come out of those standards. And so those are the professionals, those are the code enforcement folks. Things tend to work a lot quicker there. NFPA really kind of combines most of that. So between electrical code, that's the National Electrical Code. NFPA 70 is everything electricity. And then they've got a bunch of other standards. NFPA 30 is all the flammable liquids. Life safety code, so how doors are configured, how many exits you have to have, how the stairways need to be built. That's all NFPA. So most of those codes actually came out of the risk groups, not so much any regulatory body. But that said, when OSHA was tasked with writing our regulations, we borrowed heavily from the industry codes. We had to change the words around a little bit and take away some of the things that present an undue burden, or we have to do a cost analysis with everything. So basically we have two sets of standards, basically. There's general industry and construction. And what we did to write the general industry standards was just go to ANSI and say, we're going to take all these standards and make them law. So ANSI is American National Standards Institute. So
if there are bribes paid, if actual corruption is happening, and this could be for either of you, how is that dealt with in terms of enforcement?
Well, I can't name any specific
No.
standards or anything like that. I can't say it. That would be criminal. That would be racketeering. That would be Department of Justice. So the laws that OSHA enforces are administrative laws, or in a general category of civil laws. So it's essentially, there's no real jail time. We do have a small piece of criminal liability within our standards. Won't get too into it because it's a little complicated, but and most of the time we kick our criminal enforcement to the local folks. But
Would they rely on your information to do the enforcement part of it?
so certainly our information is used on occasion for criminal. We do have a criminal person in the region who coordinates with them so that we can keep that compartmentalized.
So if OSHA is involved in a case, for example, like would there be expert witnesses from OSHA, or
Potentially. It all really depends on what we did. And it's separately from bribes, but just in terms of general liability, a lot of times we don't assign causality to anything. We're not tasked with being able to do that. We don't carry the expertise. There's other agencies that can do that. But a lot of times, personal injury attorneys love OSHA reports. We, through the Freedom of Information Act, those go out quite a bit. And so when people are hurt, certainly our information gets used to develop a case, but by itself, it doesn't usually show criminality.
And Bob, I was wondering, because we had Stephen Puleo here last week talking about the Great Molasses Flood, which resulted in one of the biggest civil cases in corporate liability.
Yep.
Do we see anything like that on the civil side of people suing the owners, or any sort of attempt at compensation to some of these
There's
workers?
no, because of that court case that was up there, basically, I actually spent time talking to an attorney friend of mine about what the law meant in the 1840s, and sort of you're in there at your own risk. And that was basically how he sort of instructed me to interpret it, that they couldn't blow back necessarily on, they couldn't be sued, in other words. And there was no workers' compensation then either. So what happened initially in Lawrence is when the building caved in, people started sending donations to the city. And the city, through the mayor's office, set up a fund to, in effect, it was kind of like to set up workers' comp, right? But, I mean, there was no legal framework or anything like that at the time. And the city set up a series of inspections, like people would visit people's homes to actually make sure they were really hurt. It was very sort of social Darwinian at the time, like people would be somehow like faking it, right? So a lot of money came in 2 or 3 weeks in small donations, and they kept these really, one of the fascinating things I looked at in doing the research were the logbooks. They logged in every donation. And the logbooks survived. And so you can see this group of workers, or that factory, or this church, or $3, $5, $10. And so quite a bit of money came in the first 2 or 3 weeks. And the mayor of Lawrence basically put out a notice for people not to send any more money. And he said publicly that if we collect too much money, all these people are never going to want to go back to work. So we need to cut them off. And so that was kind of harsh. At least my interpretation of that was a fairly sort of harsh thing. And then within, like by March of 1860, the people that now own the building, a couple of of men bought it who lived in Methuen, right up the road from Lawrence. They announced they were going to rebuild the building on the Pemberton on the exact site, and that they were going to use all salvageable material from the collapse in the rebuild of the Pemberton.
Wow.
Which they did. So you can go there now and see the building. It's on the exact same site. And when I look at it, it's like, I want to do like some horror film where I'm seeing like the blood seeping from the brick or something. But it seemed very weird. And there were, around New England, in the week after the building fell, there were several occasions where workers refused to go to work. Because they said, well, how do we know our building's not going to fall down? We're not going in until you tell us it's okay. And that was why the inquest happened within 3 or 4 days. They wanted it settled. This is what caused it done and dusted.
Everybody
and so,
back in.
Yeah, so by early February it was over. In terms of the inquest, the finding of guilt, and all of it, it's this dude, he did it, we're done. Get along. And yeah, I mean, I was astonished. January 14th, the inquest started. January 10th, the building falls.
Wow, that's crazy.
Today, again, it would be like 4 years later, 5 years later.
Sure. Let me
So,
take
yeah.
a couple other questions.
It was crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Gabe, can you follow the money when there's a tragedy? Can OSHA do that, or is that go through DOJ?
There's a lot of things we can do, and it all depends on, the other side. We'll just call it the other side because it's easier. They have attorneys, we have attorneys, and we go where the information leads us. Certainly, we can ask for it. A lot of times we get it. We might not necessarily. I mean, we are a regulatory body. We're given authority by Congress, so by definition, lawyers get to be involved. So,
Those guys building those pillars had looked at the pillars of the Colosseum and the Pantheon. They're still standing.
well, I do have. You did bring up a good point, and I'll just because you made me think of something that I've always found interesting. As an archaeologist, you might appreciate this, but the oldest workplace hazard on record is actually silicosis. And the Romans figured out that silica could actually damage your lungs and cause this form of cancer back when they were building the aqueducts. And just talking about speed and math, here's another math one for you. So it took us up till about 10 years ago to have a silica standard. So we got an asbestos standard right away.
That's like 5,300.
And then we get the silica standard. And I always, this is just something that I always think to myself when I think about the silica standard is, there's that old expression, well, I'm coming, and they say, so's Christmas, or so's Jesus. And I'm like, well, Jesus came and went. And we still didn't have a standard for a couple thousand years. So that's a perfect example of speed of regulation, I guess.
And that leads to a question. I mean, you don't have to put a number on it, but to what extent is negligence more an issue than outright corruption or cutting corners? Or is there a way to break that down? Does it happen more that just people are not abiding by standards, or they're just doing the wrong thing because they don't know better? Or do they know better and they're purposefully kind of skirting the regulations?
The short answer is it depends.
Okay.
50-50.
As with everything. So we do have, I talked about willful violations when we were talking about Pemberton. So there's sort of a state of mind with that. So you have to have knowledge to be legally liable for an OSHA violation. The employer has to or should have known. So if it's in a book, if it's in a standard, they have a duty to inquire. I mean, we hear that in a lot of areas. So certainly there's a duty to inquire, and I guess you could call that negligence or ignorance. A lot of people say, well, geez, I didn't know. And you say, well, you ought to. And then there's another state of mind, which is just, so that would fall in the plain indifference category, and then you've got the intentional disregard. So so the columns, for instance, not sending an inspector, that would fall in the category of just sort of plain indifference. I don't want to know. I'm going to do everything to show that I don't know. And we run into that quite a bit, and then we have to prove that people are just willfully ignoring, willfully don't want to know, just really don't care. And then there's the intentional disregard, which is just, I know those columns are bad, I really don't care. And in Pemberton, you can kind of get to that intentional disregard piece when folks are looking at gaps in the mill. That's what I was thinking about. And then they can see the space through it, and it's like, well, we're not going to really bother to engineer that out. We're just going to, how can we stop the light from coming in? It seemed to me like it was more like, let's keep the light out than,
Right.
let's keep the building standing. So hopefully that helped.
Yeah, I mean, in the aftermath of Pemberton, when I said that there were all these engineering conferences, that's where a lot of the thinking happened and the conversation that led to then regulation and led to design and other things, because the debates at the engineering conferences, when I got my colleagues at the university to help me interpret these papers, one of the conversations they were having at these meetings was the bigger, the heavier, the faster, the more pounding of the machinery, the buildings have to be designed to take all of that vibration and all of that movement and everything into account. And I never thought about it, but they're actually talking about like feng shuiing the factory, like making everything balance so that you're basically not having the building going against itself. It kind of goes this way and that way together. And I thought, I'm inelegantly saying what an engineering text would have said, but that's what it came down to. And when they built the Pemberton, in the time, again, that the folks that helped me think about this from the engineering school, from the early 1850s when they built the building, they built it to hold a certain weight. By the late 1850s, we're coming closer to the Civil War. People are worried about what might happen if there was an interruption in markets and transportation and everything else. And so the people that now own the Pemberton are packing more and more heavier and heavier machinery in a building that just in a few years, the standards changed for the weight of the technology, right? And so that's how Lowell would have got out from under it. He would have said, well, it didn't fall when I had machinery in it. It fell because you guys overpacked it, right? And so I think that would have been another one of his outs. But nobody, again, that's why I really liked the Architects and Mechanics Journal, because it was the beginnings of professionalization, of thinking about these things, people just not doing it by the seat of their pants. The other thing is that the Eagle Foundry was known in Greater Boston as a slipshod place. And I found this in the newspaper articles. And wouldn't you know, after the building fell down, they disappeared. The people that owned the Eagle Foundry were gone. And when the inquest was held, nobody from the Eagle Foundry was ever called. Wow. They were found in February or March after everything was over out in Ohio. But they were like gone. And I just imagine they heard the building fell and they said, okay, let's pack.
And were they operating a foundry in Ohio?
Probably.
So
I don't know. I tried
almost
finding out,
definitely, yeah.
but pardon?
I would feel like almost definitely.
Yeah.
But it was like, okay.
Other
I
questions?
thought I did see a hand over there at some point.
They were using the column for leverage to move things around. Did that actually contribute to the?
Yeah, the day that the mill came down, that afternoon around 3 o'clock in the inquest testimony, the person that was responsible for moving the machinery said he had been told that afternoon to move a big piece of machinery, and that was the way he did it. He basically used gigantic rubber bands, literally, and wrapped them around the machine and then used the pole to whip it around. And and said that he thought he heard something snap.
So they're using one material, cast iron, which is fine for pushing down, but when they're leveraging it, it's brittle as you're pulling on it. So
Yeah, and again, sort of like using this as an example, you've got the column like this, and then you've got a pin that's substantially smaller and thinner that basically goes from the top of one into the bottom of the one above it. And so if you snap that, right? And so the people that testified said the building started falling in the corner where that event had taken place. Other people said that by itself wouldn't have made the building fall. But if if many of the other pillars were no good, and you also already had the integrity of the building called into question, it's a lot more complicated. It was a bigger building than any other building that had ever been built at that point in Lawrence. Windows were bigger, archways were bigger. Everything about it was what John Lowell wanted. He wanted, like, as one of my students said when I was talking to them about it, said, he wanted a pyramid. He wanted testimony. He wanted, like, a grand thing to show how rich he was. And I hadn't thought about it that way, so but yeah, you're right, A for you. There you go. And so I think that was part of it as well, right? That just everything about it was shaky. And it didn't take much.
So I think in accident investigation terms, which we do a lot of, we would call that likely a contributing factor. When we do a root cause analysis, we couldn't say definitively that it was that singular event, but certainly that in combination with a bunch of other factors. We often talk about the Swiss cheese model. If one thing goes wrong, no big deal, but if one thing goes wrong and all your backstops are gone, then total chaos.
Yep. And that's how it fell. It slowly fell down. People on the first floor heard it and got out. People on the second floor heard it, got under big pieces of machinery, and were protected from, there were testimony of the rubble just tenting around people under really big pieces of machinery because the machinery was so sturdy that it held the weight of the rubble. But those were some of the people then that lost their lives in the fire because there wasn't any heavy equipment to dig them out. It was basically doing it by hand and horse-drawn pulleys and whatnot, and slow going again in the dark. And then the kerosene lanterns just made it a complete disaster. Fire companies had to come by horse, obviously. And so people are coming from New Hampshire, people are coming from Haverhill, from Amesbury, from Lowell. Yeah, all these different places with horse-drawn fire trucks. There's plenty of water because the river is right at the back, so they can pump water, but by the time they get there, the fires have already gained on the rubble as people are trying to get people out.
And after all that, they said, let's reuse some of this material to build a new one.
Yeah. Let's rebuild. So you can go there now, and the building's there, and it says Pemberton, and it's just right there on the exact footprint of the original building.
Wow. Maybe one more question, and then we'll call it. Yeah, what kind of material would they reuse?
A lot of bricks, a lot of lumber, a lot of glass that didn't break. A lot of scrap metal was sort of repurposed for other things. But there was never a really good accounting. I have one funny story. You have time for one funny story?
Sure.
In the disaster. So when the building falls, everybody in Lawrence can hear it. Lawrence is a very small, compact place. And people run out, run over. It's like this disaster. And people are waiting for their relatives who work in the building to come home, or else they're trapped, right? And so in one instance, there's a young girl who doesn't come home overnight, and her family thinks that she's lost her life. This is a true story. It's in the accounts in the newspaper. And in the morning, lo and behold, she walks in the front door, and they're like, and she has no knowledge that this happened. She doesn't know that the building collapsed. Turned out about 15, 20 minutes before the building fell, she had an argument with her supervisor. She threw a bobbin at him and ran out of the factory.
Wow.
And like went up into New Hampshire to stay with friends. Was afraid to go home because it would have meant she wasn't working, and didn't want to tell her family that she had quit.
Wow.
And then came home sheepishly in the morning to sort of confess, and they said, oh my God, they're like so happy to see her, she's alive. And then they say, you know what happened? And so basically for being pissed at her boss,
Saved her life.
She said, yeah, throwing a bobbin saved her life.
Wow.
So my
that's
daughter's in the audience, and I'll just take this moment to say, don't ever do that to me.
All right,
the news.
I want to thank Gabe and I want to thank Bob for coming out and giving us a great talk. Thank you for coming, and please come on back to the museum.